Hello friends, this is Grease speaking. Today we're looking at tiers 7 and 8 of the Disturbing Manga Iceberg, and I have to say, these two tiers have got some absolutely twisted entries. It's really non-stop psycho stuff here. If you want to skip straight ahead to the iceberg, go right ahead, I'm not going to be offended, but I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping up top. First of all, thank you guys for supporting the channel and supporting this iceberg. The last video did end up getting some traction, which was really cool to see. Welcome to all the new subscribers, I hope you keep enjoying the content. The second thing I want to talk about is that you've probably noticed that my uploads haven't been as frequent as they usually are. Because of recent life events and responsibilities, I just feel like I can't keep up with weekly uploads and still maintain the quality that I want to have in the videos. So at least through the summer, I plan on uploading every 2 weeks. And hopefully I can get back to weekly uploads here in a few months. That being said, I'm still completely dedicated to the channel and I'm working on some really cool stuff, so there will be no shortage of content. It'll just come out with bigger gaps in between. Anyway, that's enough blobbering out of me. Let's just get right to the good stuff. This is the Disturbing Manga Iceberg, Part 4. Tier 7, JINMEN. JINMEN might be one of my favorite finds while doing this iceberg because it's genuinely creepy. Masato is a high school student who used to spend all his time at his hometown zoo and is returning after 7 years to visit. Since he last visited the zoo, something seems off. He meets up with his old zookeeper pal who tells him that there's been a change in zoo directors and that the animals have been acting weird lately. The next day he plans on meeting his childhood friend at the zoo. They get there early and sneak in, but there are no animals or staff around. Suddenly, shit hits the fan when they witness a security guard being eaten alive by hyenas. This is when things get weird. It appears the animals now have human faces and are trying to kill all humans. It's a pretty crazy premise, but the art style on the animals is really well done and unsettling. Definitely recommend this one. Kyosei Tensei. Kyosei Tensei is about Anazaki, a genius teenager whose girlfriend Yuno was assaulted by 15 men and then killed. Anazaki murders all 15 of the culprits for revenge and then is executed for his crimes. Something that he's fine with because he just wants to see Yuna again in the afterlife. However, he wakes up in a parallel dimension where an extreme solar flare has warped the minds of all men, turning them into zombie-like beasts who simply mimic their old behaviors and try and sexually assault, murder, and then eat any woman they come across. Anazaki runs into a group of surviving teenage girls from his high school when he realizes that Yuna may still be alive somewhere in this alternate world, and so the story begins. It definitely doesn't hold back on the violence with some brutal deaths throughout. Okatenamoru. This has to have one of the most batshit crazy openings to any comic on this list. A man's head suddenly transforms into a giraffe's head and begins biting and eating people while dragging their corpses around. I mean, what the hell? As far as I can tell, this is caused by some parasite, and of course the main character, a normal high school student, gains the ability to harness and utilize this transformative power. Or something. Inugami Hikase. Inugami Hikase, or Inugami Expert, is another one by our old buddy Maruo Suhiro, who is, if you remember, the author of Paranoia Star and SHOUJO TSUBAKI. It follows a high school boy who discovers a dark secret. His school crush was being taken advantage of by their teacher, and once the teacher found out that she was pregnant, pushed her out of the school window to her death. The boy, seeking revenge, decides he'll use the power of an Inugami, which is a dog spirit, in order to enact revenge on the teacher. He chops off the head of a dog and begins practicing the rituals with a voodoo-like doll, focusing curses on the teacher. Unfortunately, the teacher gets wise and follows the boy to his secret shrine. Here he discovers what the boy is up to and buries him from the neck down, starving him to the point where he'll eat anything, so the teacher feeds him a maggot-infested rat to eat. Ugh. Eventually the boy's body is actually possessed by the Inugami and he rips the teacher into pieces. Rad. Ugyaku no Kakeko. So the English name for this manga is Attack on Cocks Cluck Cluck, which tells you all you need to know. The premise is that one day adults start turning into giant chickens and eating the brains of teens and children. So the MC, who volunteers at the local orphanage, must protect the orphans from these monsters. It's insane, but in a really fun way. I will say the initial moment we see someone transform is very disturbing. The principal suddenly rips his clothes off, runs up to a lady, and bites her boob off. It's just so sudden and hard to look at. Then of course his face explodes, revealing the chicken head underneath. Yeah, this is the type of manga that I started this iceberg for. Yajin. Yajin follows a young teen, Onda, who has the ability to see ghosts. Despite being able to see ghosts around, she can't touch them and thus lives in misery, especially since there's a ghost that won't stop talking at the foot of her bed. Meanwhile, two of her classmates, Utsugi and Takajao, find out that they have the ability to leave their bodies and float around as spirits. And while in this form, they can actually interact with both ghosts and humans. The three team up after they're able to expel the ghost from Onda's room. It's a cool twist on the girl sees ghost genre and has a good sense of humor as well. The Outer Zone. The Outer Zone is clearly inspired by the Twilight Zone, with every chapter telling a different tale of people in strange and horrific encounters. This is all narrated by a mysterious elf woman who guides you through the chapters. Keiko and the False Detective. Satoru is a brilliant young detective sought after by the police for his remarkable reasoning skills. However, he has a secret ability, the ability to see and communicate with the spirits of the deceased. These restless spirits provide him with crucial hints and insights that aid him in solving complex cases. He encounters a peculiar ghost named Keiko who boldly declares herself to be a god. Intrigued and curious, Satoru becomes entangled in a series of enigmatic cases orchestrated by Keiko. It's essentially a buddy cop manga if one of the buddies was a ghost girl. Kinda cool. Emerging. Emerging is essentially about a deadly pathogen that starts spreading throughout Japan, starting with one man whose eyes begin to bleed before he basically explodes in the street. Gnarly. Fukuju Toshi. This is another one of those suddenly everyone starts getting killed by something weird kind of stories. It revolves around Kyo, a high school kid hanging out with his friends in Tokyo. He loses a bet and is forced to wear a tacky shirt with an old anime character on it, when suddenly they stumble upon the site of a massacre. And the culprit? Clothing. Yeah, so basically people's clothes start morphing into giant monster mouths that eat humans. So Kyo and one of his only surviving friends, Mawata, attempt to escape the madness. The premise of killer clothing works well for fan service because Mawata must remove her clothes early on in order to avoid being possessed by them, and it actually made me laugh because of how absurd the whole thing is. It gets even weirder when Kyo is completely surrounded by the monsters and suddenly transforms into a kaiju-sized clothing monster that just wrecks everybody before turning back into human form, where the anime character on his t-shirt begins talking to him. So yeah, that's the basic setup. Despite having a crazy premise, there are a few elements here that make it interesting. Continue to be killed summer. Yeah, the English title doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. It follows two friends who are walking home one night when suddenly a businessman without a face kills them both. They awake the next morning assuming it was a bad dream until the man shows up and kills them yet again. They realize every day they wake up is actually the same, and from there they attempt to solve the mystery of the no-faced man while avoiding being killed. It's not the most original premise. The movie Happy Death Day comes to mind here, but I'm not sure which came first. ANAMORPHOSIS no MEIJUU. Well, I really didn't think we'd reach this level of depravity until the final two tiers, but here we are. Anamorphosis is what is known as eroguro. Eroguro being short for eroticism, and guro comes from the word grotesque, even though it's often confused for meaning gore. This manga is pretty weird because half of it is one singular story that isn't even that gory compared to the second half of the book, which is just full-on eroguro. So the first half is about a rich dude who basically holds a contest where he recreates the scenes of horrible crimes and summons the ghosts of the dead. Then he has a group of people see how long they can last staying on the recreated set he's built. In this particular scene, a man dies while on the set of a kaiju movie when a gunpowder rig goes wrong and blows off half the dude's face. So the people are on the miniature set and the ghost of the dude in the kaiju suit appears and kills them in gruesome ways. It's a pretty elaborate setup and gets a little confusing by the end. But at one point the people shrink down for some reason and have to escape the ghost as if he's an actual kaiju, which is kind of cool. Now let's just briefly go over the more depraved second half of this manga because it is truly bizarre. Each chapter is a different unconnected story that features horrible things happening. In one story, a girl proclaims herself a rainy girl. For whatever reason, wherever she goes, it begins raining. Well, she eventually is kidnapped by a mad scientist who has found several rain people and begins forcing them to breed so that they can ship the rain babies to other countries, forcing heavy rain to drown them out. It's just straight up bonkers, dude. Well, so the rain girl is forced to have babies, which for whatever reason it shows in graphic detail. Speaking of babies, another story is about a couple whose neighbor keeps coming over to offer them leftovers. Eventually the police show up and inform them that the neighbor was kidnapping children, chopping them up, and making food out of them, which is what she was bringing over to the couple. Pretty disgusting. Another story that feels like Junji Ito on crack and Blue Chew features a high school girl who tries to get some students to come back to school after they become shut-ins. They're portrayed as huge, disgusting blobs that fill the rooms and buildings that they're in. At one point, a student who is overflowing out of his house tells his crush that he likes her. The crush is also a mass blob and neighbor who feels the same way, and so the giant blobs begin to... what the hell am I reading? All the stories are like this, just really grotesque, bizarre scenarios. I've had enough with this one, let's move on. 17 Sai. So 17 Sai is sort of notorious as it's a manga based on the real-life case of Junko Furuta, which may be familiar to some of you, but just a brief summary. Junko was a beloved high school student who was kidnapped by a group of teen boys and subsequently raped, tortured, and eventually killed. In the realm of true crime, this is a particularly rough one, so it's become somewhat popular to cover. And along with its popularity has come some questionable media inspired by it, which leads us to 17 Sai. In some areas, it's directly taking from the Junko case, but in other ways, it's very different. Like, a large part of this manga is the fact that the kidnapped girl has a twin sister that is desperately trying to find her, whereas Junko had no twin. Where it really takes from the real-life story is the way the girl's treated. She's confined to a room where she's taken advantage of by multiple men, beaten, and starved. One particular scene shows the girl being burned with lighter fluid, which of course happened in the real-life case and is pretty brutal. You get the idea at this point, and I think it's worth noting that this manga is pretty controversial for obvious reasons. A lot of people think it's messed up for the author to make entertainment out of a horrifying life event. One of the differences between the story and real life is that in the comic, the girl actually survives the events, whereas Junko did not. Which you could make the argument that the author was trying to tell an alternate story that had a happy ending. I haven't seen any interviews with the author, so who knows, he could be a real dirtbag for all I know, but it just brings up the age-old question of, where's the line? For instance, if it's immoral to make entertainment based off of real-life victims of horrible crimes, then Law & Order Special Victims Unit is a horrible offender, and it's one of the most popular shows on TV. It's an interesting thing to think about, but anyway, I've gotten way off course here. Let's move on. Tier 8. SHOUJO KAITAI. SHOUJO KAITAI, which translates to something like Dismantled Girl, is a collection of gory short stories with each chapter telling a different scary story, such as one where a girl begins hearing the strange cries of a baby at night. Eventually she realizes the cries are coming from her own belly, and she decides she's going to get rid of it when suddenly the cries begin to form words, "Don't kill me," and the fetus begins to claw its way out of her stomach, followed by dozens more. So weird. In another story, a girl sent to live with her creepy relatives. At dinner, she's served a strange meat that almost looks like a face. She later helps her cousin change her bandage when she finds a face-like tumor growing on her cousin's head. The cousin demands that she slice it off of her head, and we find out that this is what she'd been eating for dinner that night. Gross. Her other cousin also happens to enjoy cutting himself, and the rest of the family drink his blood. There's a few other stories in the same vein, but you get the gist. Tokyo Red Hood. Tokyo Red Hood is some real Eroguro trash. It's a very weird plot that seems to just serve as an attempt to justify the very fucked up acts we see. But basically, Little Red Hood is a girl who also happens to be a psychopath murderer and cannibal. Oh, and I forgot to mention she's immortal, so we often see her body torn apart in various ways. But the real reason this manga has such a dark reputation is that Red Hood is an 11-year-old girl, and she seems to not be able to help herself from having sex with grown men, usually before killing them. It's pretty dark because of this aspect and makes the whole thing seem beyond fucked up to read, so I quickly noped out of this one if I'm being honest. SHOUJO Pandora. SHOUJO Pandora is a horror anthology with 4 chapters. In the first chapter, a girl is brought back to life by a demon with a new body that she uses to kill off her bullies for revenge. The second story is about a maid who's hired to stay at a mansion with an old doctor. Turns out he has a human doll as a daughter who's stitched together like Frankenstein, and they begin to try to kill the maid because the doll likes her face and wants to use it. The third story is about a group of students staying by a lake when they're attacked by fish-like humanoids. And the final story is the most gory, as a human-sized puppet girl begins killing people and mutilating their corpses, pulling their chests open and dismembering them. Akai Hon. Akai Hon is another anthology horror manga. A group of people are gathered around telling ghost stories, and each chapter tells a different tale. It's a little hit and miss, but there are some frightening moments. One story is about an adult actress who shows up to set, and there's something weird about her. When they review the footage, her face is all messed up, and then she starts appearing in other films after the fact, but in the background. There's a great story where a woman's body starts slowly retracting into itself, and it's really unsettling. So you get the idea. The stories all vary, but the running theme throughout is there's a very particular style used on the ghost faces, which is pretty freaky. Gift Plus Minus. This is one where the English translation that I read wasn't great, but as far as I understand, the story follows a high school girl who kidnaps criminals or otherwise morally corrupt individuals in order to harvest their organs, which are donated to hospitals. Pretty cool premise, I gotta say. Iron Ghost no Shoujo. This is a pretty unique idea. Essentially, it follows a high school girl who has the ability, using a satanic ritual, to transfer her soul into a strange battle doll that she calls an Iron Ghost and uses to kick ass, encountering cultists, murderers, and psychopaths. It isn't long before she finds others who use the same technique to transfer their souls into dolls with their own unique abilities, and there you have it. Satanister, or Satanister? Anyway, it's by the same author as Iron Ghost and is just straight up bonkers. It starts when a group of people online who all want to die decide they're going to meet up and do it together. One of the members of the group, Valkyrie, shows up and secretly drugs them. They all wake up in the woods wearing bunny outfits. Turns out, Valkyrie is a straight-up killer psycho who dresses people up this way just to hunt and kill them. She tells them that if anyone can escape her, they'll be given a gift that money can't even buy. After losing most of her limbs, one of the bunnies does manage to escape and then realizes what the prize is. After fighting to escape death, she realizes now that she wants to live. It's a pretty cool idea and an interesting way for Valkyrie to justify the killings since the people were planning on dying anyway. Things get even weirder when we find out that Valkyrie is doing all of this in preparation for an upcoming tournament where psycho killers like her from all around the world are going to battle each other. Killer Shark in Another World. Killer Shark in Another World is just hilarious. It follows a young mage in training who attempts to summon a familiar into her world, but it goes wrong when she accidentally summons a giant killer shark that goes on a rampage. It seems to have the power to change size at will, and it can swim on land somehow. The shark is cute and friendly towards the mage, but it just fucks everyone else up who comes in contact with it. So it's just one crazy situation into the next, and pretty funny, I gotta say. Kaze no Matenro. Kaze no Matenro is about a mysterious middle school kid with a scar across his eye that transfers from school to school battling monsters, ghosts, and demons. It's actually really cool and pulls a lot from classic monster movies. For instance, the monster in the first issue looks just like Nosferatu from the classic 20s horror film. It's worth checking out. SHOUJO TSUBAKI. Honestly, I probably should have had this one on an earlier tier because of how widely known it is, but SHOUJO TSUBAKI, aka Midori, is a manga and anime film that's regarded by many as one of the most disturbing mangas ever made and has been banned in many countries. But let's just dive into the story. Midori is a young girl whose parents die. Now that her parents are dead, she has no place to go and ends up staying with a circus troupe. Most of the manga after this follows Midori being both physically and sexually abused by the circus performers. The fact that she's an underage girl makes a lot of this particularly messed up, and it's not a shock as to why this was banned so heavily. Midori is just ridiculed and degraded and straight up raped. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Eventually, a magician arrives at the circus, and it turns out that the dude has actual magical powers. He ends up falling in love with Midori and marrying her. There's a lot of creepy stuff here because they're like smooching and making out and stuff, and keep in mind that Midori is 12 years old, so yuck. Besides the gross pedo stuff, there's a ton of gore in this film. There's just a lot of detailed body horror kind of stuff and graphic imagery. One part just straight up shows the magician killing a ton of people in grotesque ways by having their bodies deformed and exploding. This scene includes showing kids die, just so you know. Probably the most disturbing scene is when Midori finds some adorable loving puppies and one of the circus performers picks one up, smashes it into the ground, and then stomps on it so that its guts and brains explode out of its body. Later that night they eat stew and she reveals that it's dog meat from the puppy she killed. Of course, this is after everyone eats it, including Midori. It's altogether just really strange and violent. I can't even really get into all the story details because it gets to the point where it's sort of hard to follow. It's one of those mangas where people have different interpretations of it and even theories as to what it all means, especially regarding the confusing ending. A lot of the reviews I've seen tend to criticize it for just being needless exploitation and there isn't much of a plot or story to follow, while others defend it as a work of art, but I don't know, you can be the judge, I guess. ICHI the Killer. Oh boy, ICHI the Killer's a real doozy. Not in a bad way, but just in a really messed up way. It follows Ichi, a young man who's manipulated by his uncle, a gang member, into killing people. As Ichi cuts people into bits with his dope-ass metal boots, there is a Yakuza member named Kakihara who's attempting to track him down. That's the basic idea, and we'll get back to some more story elements in a second, but let's take a moment to cover some of the insane violence in this manga. I already mentioned that Ichi has a tendency to go psycho and slice people into pieces, including one great sequence where he slices a guy's face off. But Ichi's form of violence is more straightforward. Kakihara is a straight up sadist who tortures and injures people in horribly brutal ways that are just hard to look at. At one point he has a man naked and suspended in the air by hooks, and he begins to pour hot oil onto his back, face, and well, it's pretty bad, let's just say that. He also enjoys stabbing people with needles. It's kind of his signature move. It's worth noting that Kakihara has a Glasgow smile, but unlike the Joker, his is unhealed and literally kept together by piercings through his lips. At one point, a guy pulls the piercings out of his face, ripping his lips open. Kakihara retaliates by stabbing a needle through the guy's cheeks and yanking it out, ripping the guy's face completely open. Yeah, Kakihara is one ruthless psycho. He even cuts part of his tongue off at one point. There's so many moments like that, I could go on forever, but you get the idea. So yeah, the blood, gore, and torture are bad, but surprisingly it's not the most unsettling part of this manga. So Kakihara obviously has a thing for torture, not just on others, but on himself, and he actually gets sexually aroused by pain. And so does Ichi. So basically Ichi gets aroused every time he kills people or even watches people being injured or killed. In fact, he jerks off after his killing sprees. It kind of sucks because you actually sympathize with him and he's a really badass character other than this element, which just makes you cringe. I'll give you an example that to me was one of the most fucked up moments in the whole thing and probably on the iceberg so far. Ichi often goes to a prostitute who he develops feelings for. This prostitute is abused by her partner and Ichi decides he's going to kill the guy. Well, he shows up to their house one night and witnesses the abuse firsthand as the guy beats the living hell out of her and then begins to use her for the dirty deed. So what does Ichi do? Does he go in and take the dude out? No. Ichi watches through the window and beats off. Obviously, Ichi has major issues, and you find out why through flashback sequences, but man, that kind of stuff is just hard to stomach. So Kakihara and Ichi play this game of cat and mouse as Ichi continues killing for his uncle and Kakihara tracks him down. It is one of the most wild mangas I've ever read, but I can't say it's not gripping. Okay guys, that's 8 tiers down and 2 more to go. So once again, thank you for all the support, especially from my patrons, Naomi Romero, Soma, Krusty the Crab, and One Group. You guys are awesome. If you're enjoying my content and want to support my channel, you can check out my Patreon, the link's below. But as always, I appreciate you watching at all, so thank you. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.